Hello and welcome to StratNews Global. I'm Surya Gangadharan. Professor Srikanth, what is your initial view of the China's latest defense budget?
This is, by the way, allocation. This is not the budget. So next year we will probably find, if they provide us with information, then we will find what is the actual the defense budget outlay for the last year. So there is a problem with the figures. In any way, the official figures increase a rise of 6.6%. There is no decline in the budget. There is an increase of 6.6. Today, they follow coordinated development. But the various estimates for this year, IMF, for example, suggested that China's economy will grow at 1.2%. So if China is growing at 1.2%, by the way, Premier Li Keqiang did not mention what will be the growth rate for this year. He had not mentioned the growth rate, unlike every other year. So assuming the IMF projections are going to be true, and it is likely because first 6 months have already gone with the COVID-19 impact, and hence there is some disruption because of the coronavirus effect. So assuming IMF projection of 1.2 is correct, then the allocation of 6.6 is actually 6 times the civilian economy. So we need to keep this in mind. Forget about the Chinese military propaganda or the Chinese state propaganda that there is a reduction in the budget. There is actually a 6% increase, 5 times nearly increase in the budget process when the civilian economy is down by 1.2%.
Srikanth, can we assume that the internal security thing does not figure in this? That's a separate budget on its own? The spending on PAP and all that.
Exactly.
Is that this budget or separate?
It is separate. And in fact, the internal budget is more than the defense budget.
So how much would it be if this is 177 and between 177 and $300 billion? What is the internal security budget like?
Official budget is over $200 billion. And we do not know again what is the unofficial budget. So if you look at the Indian defense budget, it is slightly more than the internal budget. Of course, internal budget in India is the subject of the state under the constitution, not the union, nor in the concurrent list. But if you pull together all the 29 states, their policing functions, budget, etc., it doesn't really match the defense budget of over $60 billion in India. But we see...
Srikanth, this the allocation for the Army, Navy, and Air Force. What is the rough breakdown?
There is a huge while officially there is no mention of this. That is why I said if you look at the Indian defense budget, there is an allocation. How much an Arjun battle tank costs will also be given in the budgetary process. But how much a T-98 tank costs is not mentioned in China. So having said that, the army used to receive about 50%, 55% in 1950s, the Chinese army. And the Navy was getting something like 14%, 15%. And the Air Force was getting 9%, something like that. Today, the Chinese Air Force gets about 24%. And the Navy gets around 19% or so. The Navy also gets about 24%, while the Army gets roughly around 22%, between 18 to 22%. Unlike the Indian Army, which gets 54%, unlike the Indian Air Force, which gets about 17%, unlike the Indian Navy, which gets about, say, 19%, The Chinese Navy gets more, Chinese Air Force gets more, while Chinese Army gets less, unlike the Indian Army. Both having almost the same roles, the
Yeah.
counterinsurgency operations, and so on and so forth. Yet the Chinese have identified Navy and Air Force because these are power projection forces. Yeah.
These pensions that are there in part of our defense budget, they come as part of this package, or are they separate? Pensions
It's
for
true. It's true. Pensions, maintenance, training, all these come under salaries, come under the official allocations, both in China and in India. But there is a sleight of hand here. The pensions today are now the local governments have to pay the ex-servicemen in China, and the local provincial level governments are not paying, and hence there are a lot of demonstrations by the PLA troops across China.
What about nuclear weapons, Srikanth? Where do they figure here? Spending on nuclear weapons.
It comes under the R&D, and R&D is not part of the defense allocations. So there is a problem with that nuclear. And last week, the Global Times editor mentioned that China should increase its stockpile to 1,000 nuclear warheads. So under which head they are going to bring in is not clear, because part of the nuclear weapons come under the civilian nuclear program. So like the space program. So there is a problem with the nuclear weapons funding programs. Military procurements from Russia, they, for instance, signed a $20 billion agreement in the late 90s. That is not part of the PLA budget. So Su-27s, Su-30s, Sovereign class destroyers, the Kilo class submarines, the Su-35s, the S-400 air defense systems, these are very capital intensive platforms. None of these are included in the allocations mentioned yesterday. So you can say that there is so much of obfuscation in the PLA budgeting.
In fact,
Although
one gets the impression, Srikanth, that their defense budget may be as close to the American budget than what we presume.
Yes, the Pentagon budget is $735 billion or so. And the Chinese budget is estimated around 300. So it is nearly half of the Pentagon's budget. We do not know, but if you include all the items, it could even go far beyond. I did not mention the space program. I did not mention the other. Recently, Xi Jinping called for military civilian fusion. For instance, 5G. For instance, civilian universities, graduates will join the R&D systems of the PLA. That is not included in the budget. So the civilian universities groom the talent, but the PLA absorbs these in cyber warfare, space warfare, maritime warfare, or in other new domains. And at least a portion of these are reserved for the military. In 5G, for example, in telecommunications, Pato series of satellites, for example, have military channels. A portion of this is included in the military, although the budget for that is under the Space Ministry, which comes under the civilian State Council budget. So there is a problem with these allocations.
So when you look at the kind of budget that we come up with, I mean, basically, what are the lessons here for us?
I wanted to mention that if you see the Indian defense budget, there is a zero-based budgeting process. So so not incremental, not the pushing up the things, but one is zero based, the other is strict auditing.
Yeah.
The joke in India is if you have to air refuel, the pilot is going to ask for a bill, even if you are air refueling in the skies. So, so the auditing procedures are so stiff, sometimes ridiculous as well. In China, there is so much of flexibility on this. None of these are audited. For instance, the logistics services are not part of the auditing. There is no centralized auditing system in China till recently. Last 10, 15 years, there is a centralized auditing, but not inclusive of the logistic services or other services. So as a result, there is no accountability in PLA.
Not in China. So there is an element of official sanction for all this.
Indeed. And since President Xi Jinping began an anti-corruption drive, many of these things have come to the fore. But we do not know what exactly is underlying. My hunch is this is just a tip of the iceberg.
I see. So last question, Srikanth. What do we take away from this? Does it mean that we have to hike our budget or spend it better? Or perhaps, what do we do? We can't really compete on with the kind of dollars they're spending.
So what we have seen is China surpassed completely because the Chinese objective became more in South China Sea, Taiwan, East China Sea, India-China border areas, while Indian philosophy was we are not interested in any sovereignty claims. We are not, expanding. We have no expansionist mindset. And the other, so I think this is one factor. The second is China's defense allocations has resulted in security dilemmas for countries in the neighborhood. That's why they have formed the Quad. That's why they formed other, semi-military alliances or even alliances with the US, or they have formed the diplomatic, groupings. So this is the second aspect where India needs to learn to exert pressure in non-defense budgetary format, that is trying to use diplomacy for addressing this issue of Chinese defense allocations. The third, of course, we cannot match, as the Indian Navy chief once mentioned, we cannot match the Chinese for ship by ship, as he said. So there is, because that would be an arms race, and we know what happened to the Soviet Union involving in an arms race. But there is a certain subtle arms race between India and China as well. For instance, when the Chinese deployed the SSBN, Strategic Nuclear Submarine, in Yulin Base, the Qin-class SSBN in Yulin Base in Hainan, Indian Navy chief also asked for the development of Arihant, INS Arihant. So we also are involved in subtle arms race because of this budgetary reflection. But this is only subtle so far, not very explicit. We are not matching ship by ship, but there is a subtle, competition. I think we are governed more by what happens in our borders, what happens in the Indian Ocean. We're not looking at, say, South China Sea or other areas where we expect Japan or Australia or Vietnam or others to take up cudgels with China. So that is very subtle. So what is my opinion in this? I think there is a problem for China in order to maintain this. They are following a Soviet pattern Again, a very subtle Soviet pattern, not very explicit arms race with the United States. Yet we see that since the decline in Chinese economy since last 4 or 5 years, but the defense budget has been hiked, so which suggests that they are following a Soviet pattern of arms race. And in the long run, this is actually problematic for China. Unless until they grab strategic resources, which could compensate for the defense budget. And that is the reason why they are focusing on South China Sea, because there are strategic reserves in South China Sea. If they grab, for example, Aksai Chin, if they grab a few lands, it may not be really worth it, except from a sovereignty nationalism perspective. It doesn't really, for instance, the Tibet Railway and other expenditures that they maintain is actually not economical. So there is a problem with these allocations in China also. In the long term, it is likely that they are turning out to be another Soviet Union.
So smoke and mirrors, Srikanth, what you see is not what you get. And it would seem that India needs to study the tea leaves carefully, and we can't really outspend the Chinese, but we need to be far more pragmatic and far more visionary in our thinking. Thank you very much. Pleasure talking to you.
Thank you.